Imagine you are walking down a cobblestone street 700 years ago. The air smells like wood smoke and old water. You see a huge crowd gathered in the town square. People aren't there for a market or a puppet show. They are there to watch something much darker. In the Middle Ages, the law wasn't just about rules. It was about fear. If you broke the law, the goal wasn't just to stop you, it was to make sure nobody else ever thought about doing what you did. Some of the ways people were punished were so scary that even the people in charge of the execution, the men whose job it was to do the deed, sometimes felt sick. Are you ready to see the 20 most terrifying ways people were executed in old Europe? We aren't just talking about a quick end. We are talking about things that lasted for days, things that turned the human body into a warning sign. The truth is way worse than what you see in the movies. Let's start our countdown with a machine made of wood and iron that sounds like a nightmare. Number 20, the breaking wheel. Imagine a giant wooden wheel, like the kind you see on a big farm wagon. But this wheel isn't for a horse. It's for a person. In places like France and Germany, if you were a very bad criminal, the judge would sentence you to the wheel. The executioner didn't start by putting you on the wheel. First, they laid you out on the ground or a wooden platform. They would put pieces of wood under your arms and legs. Then, the executioner would pick up a heavy iron bar. Think about the sound of a dry branch snapping in the woods. Now, imagine that sound coming from a person. The executioner would hit the limbs, breaking the bones over and over. They were very careful not to kill the person yet. They wanted the body to become as soft as a piece of rope. Once the bones were broken, they would weave the person's arms and legs through the spokes of the wheel. It made the human body look like a giant, broken spider. Then, they would put the wheel on top of a tall pole and lift it high into the sky. The person might stay alive like that for 2 or 3 days. They would be out in the sun with no water. Birds would come and land on them. People would walk by and point. The re-hook here is simple. Imagine the terror of watching the sun go down, knowing you are stuck 10 feet in the air, unable to move a single finger, waiting for the next day to start. Number 19, the forest of stakes. If you think one person on a wheel is scary, imagine an entire forest made of people. This wasn't just a punishment, it was a way to win a war without even fighting. In the 1400s, there was a leader named Vlad. Today, we know him as the inspiration for Dracula. But back then, his nickname was the Impaler. Why? Because he turned his entire country into a nightmare. Impalement is a very simple, very slow way to die. They would take a long wooden pole, as thick as a tree branch, and sharpen the end into a point. They would cover it in grease so it was slippery. The prisoner would be forced down onto the stake. The goal was for the stake to go all the way through the body without hitting the heart or the lungs. If the executioner was good at his job, the person wouldn't die right away. They would just be stuck there. Vlad once did this to 20,000 people at the same time. When the enemy army marched toward his city, they rounded a corner and saw thousands of poles sticking out of the ground, each one holding a person. It looked like a forest of dead trees. The enemy army was so scared they turned around and ran away without ever swinging a sword. The horror wasn't just the pain, it was the math. Imagine seeing 20,000 people, all suffering at once. It made the whole world feel cold. Number 18, flayed for display. What is the one thing that protects your whole body? Your skin. It keeps you warm and safe. But in the Middle Ages, the law could take that away from you, too. Flaying means skinning. It was a punishment used for people who lied or for judges who were dirty and took bribes. The message was, you didn't protect the law, so the law won't protect you. The executioner would use a very sharp, very small knife. They would start at the head or the feet and slowly, very slowly, remove the skin in one piece. They tried to keep the person awake as long as possible. Without skin, the air feels like fire. Every tiny breeze feels like 1,000 needles hitting your muscles. But the execution wasn't the end. The payoff was what they did with the skin afterward. In England, there are stories of skins being nailed to church doors or courtroom doors. Imagine going to school or work and having to walk past a door covered in the skin of a criminal. You would touch the door handle and feel the texture. It was a permanent reminder that if you broke the rules, you would lose your very identity. Number 17, boiled alive. We've talked about iron bars, wooden stakes, and sharp knives. But what about something you have in your kitchen right now? Water. Boiling was a special punishment. In England, King Henry VIII decided it was the perfect death for people who tried to poison others. If you used a liquid to kill someone, the law would use a liquid to kill you. They would bring out a giant metal pot, like a bathtub made of iron. They would fill it with water, oil, or even melted lead. Then, they would tie the person up and lower them in. Sometimes, they would put the person in when the water was cold and then light a fire underneath. Think about how it feels when you accidentally touch a hot stove for 1 second. Now imagine being inside the pot as the water starts to bubble. The steam would get so thick you couldn't breathe. The crowd would stand back because the smell was so strong. Records say that in the year 1531, a man named Richard Roos was boiled in front of a huge crowd. People could hear him for blocks away. It was a loud, messy, and very public way to go. It made everyone realize that even the simplest things, like water, could become a weapon if you crossed the king. Intermission. Why did they watch? You might be wondering, why did people go to see this? Why didn't they stay home? In the Middle Ages, there was no TV, no internet, and no news. The town square was where everything happened. Parents would bring their children to these executions. They wanted their kids to see exactly what happened to bad people. It was a lesson. If you grow up seeing a man on a wheel, you are probably going to be a very quiet, very well-behaved kid. But as we get into the top 15, the punishments stop being just painful and start becoming strange. Number 16, the sack of animals. Have you ever seen a dog and a cat get into a fight? It's loud, fast, and scary. Now, imagine being trapped in a dark bag with them while you are underwater. This was a very old punishment called the pena culiae. It was used for a very specific crime, hurting your own parents. In the Middle Ages, your family was the most important thing. If you turned against them, the law turned the whole world against you. The executioners would take a large sack made of thick leather or heavy cloth. They wouldn't just put the person inside. They would add friends. Usually, they picked 4 animals, a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a snake. Why these animals? People back then thought these animals represented bad traits. The dog was seen as messy, the snake as sneaky, the monkey as a trickster, and the rooster as angry. The bag was sewn shut so no light could get in. Then, the bag was thrown into a deep river. As the bag sank, the animals would get terrified. They didn't know why they were in the dark. They would start to claw, bite, and scratch at anything they felt, which was the person. The person wasn't just drowning, they were being attacked in the dark. People standing on the riverbank would watch the bag bounce and wiggle as it floated away. It was a noisy death that ended in a very quiet splash. Number 15, the boats, scaphism. Think about a beautiful summer day with a picnic. What is the one thing that ruins it? Bugs. Ants, wasps, and flies. Now, imagine if those bugs were the executioners. This method is one of the most famous, slow deaths, in history. It comes from the East, but stories about it terrified people in Europe for hundreds of years. It's called scaphism, which comes from the word for boat. They would take 2 small boats that were the same size. They would put the person in one boat and cover them with the other boat, like a sandwich. The person's head, hands, and feet would stick out of the sides. Then came the food. They would force the person to drink milk and honey. Lots of it. Then they would rub honey all over the person's face and arms. They would push the boats out into a swampy pond where the water didn't move. The smell of the honey would bring every fly and wasp for miles. Because the person was fed so much milk and honey, their body would start to rot inside the boat. This brought even more bugs. The person stayed alive for a long time. One soldier named Mithridates reportedly lived for 17 days inside the boats. Every morning, the guards would come and feed him more milk and honey just to keep him alive so the bugs could keep eating. It is a death that turns a human being into a literal nest for insects. Number 14, sawed alive. Most of the time, we use a saw to build things, like a house or a table. But in the Middle Ages, a saw was used to tear things apart in the most literal way possible. Sawing was a punishment for rebels, people who tried to start a new government or take over a city. The leaders wanted to show that they could split the problem in half. The prisoner was tied by their ankles and hung upside down. This is the science of the torture. When you are upside down, all the blood goes to your brain. This keeps you from fainting. You stay awake even when things get very, very bad. Two executioners would take a long, two-man saw. They would start at the bottom, which was actually the person's legs, and start sawing downward toward the head. Because the person was upside down and the blood was in their brain, they often stayed conscious until the saw reached their chest. The sound of the saw hitting bone was something that people said stayed in their nightmares for years. It was a slow, rhythmic death. Zing-zong, zing-zong. Each stroke of the saw brought the end closer, and there was nowhere to hide. Number 13, the blood eagle. The Vikings are famous for being tough. But their most famous execution wasn't about a sword, it was about a bird. Or at least, making a person look like one. The blood eagle was a ritual. It wasn't done for just any criminal. It was done for revenge. If someone killed a Viking leader's father, the leader might order the blood eagle. The person was laid face down. The executioner would use a knife to cut the shape of an eagle with spread wings onto the person's back. Then, they would use a hatchet to break the ribs away from the spine, one by one. Once the ribs were open, they would pull the lungs out through the back. The lungs would sit on the shoulders. As the person tried to breathe, the lungs would flutter. To the Vikings, it looked like the wings of an eagle flapping. Historians today argue about whether this actually happened or if it was just a scary story Vikings told to make people afraid of them. But in the Middle Ages, everyone believed it was real. They called it the ultimate way to send an enemy to the next world. Number 12, the Iron Crown. Everyone wants to be a king. Everyone wants a crown. But in the year 1514, a man named George received a crown that he definitely didn't want. George led a group of poor farmers who were angry at the rich lords. When he was caught, the lords decided to play a joke on him. They said, "You wanted to be a king? Fine. We will crown you." They built a throne out of iron. They also made a crown and a scepter out of iron. Then, they put the throne over a big fire until the metal glowed bright red. They forced George to sit on the red-hot throne. They placed the red-hot crown on his head. It was a coronation of fire. The worst part? They made his friends watch. They told his friends that if they didn't want to die the same way, they had to do something unthinkable. The story says the lords were so cruel they made the followers eat pieces of George while he was still on the throne. It shows that in the Middle Ages, the people in power didn't just want to kill you, they wanted to humiliate you and ruin your name forever. Number 11, immurement, walled up. Think about your bedroom. Now imagine if the door disappeared. And the windows disappeared. And there was nothing but stone. Immurement comes from a word that means, within walls. This wasn't a loud execution like the wheel. This was the quietest death of all. If a person broke a very serious religious rule, or if a noble betrayed a king, they might be sentenced to the wall. They would be led into a tiny room or a small space under a staircase. Then, masons, bricklayers, would start building a wall in front of them. Brick by brick, the world disappeared. The last thing the person would see was the face of the man laying the bricks. Once the last brick was in place, that was it. No light. No sound. No more people. Some people were left with a tiny hole to get bread and water for a few days, but eventually, the hole was closed too. Imagine the silence. You would hear your own heartbeat. You would hear the rats in the walls. You would wait in the dark for days until you simply went to sleep and never woke up. Centuries later, people still find skeletons hidden behind the walls of old castles. Number 10, the oubliette. The word oubliette comes from the French word oublier, which means to forget. And that is exactly what happened to you if you were thrown inside. An oubliette was a special kind of dungeon found in the bottom of castles. But it wasn't a room with a door. It was just a hole in the floor. Imagine being pushed into a dark hole that is so narrow you can't even sit down properly. The only way in or out was through a trapdoor at the very top, way above your head. Once the trapdoor was shut, the guards would literally forget you were there. You were forgotten by the world. Sometimes there was water at the bottom, or mud, or the bones of the person who was there before you. There was no trial. There was no end date. You just stayed in the dark hole until your body gave up. It was a psychological nightmare. You would look up at the tiny bit of light coming through the cracks in the trapdoor, hoping someone would remember you, but they never did. Number 9, the iron cages. Birds live in cages to keep them safe. But in the Middle Ages, cages were used to turn people into living statues for the whole town to see. If you committed a crime on the road, like robbing a traveler, the judge might put you in a gibbet or an iron cage. The cage was made of iron bars shaped like a person. They would lock you inside and hang the cage from a tall pole at the entrance of the city or at a busy crossroads. You weren't killed right away. You were just left there. No food, no water. You were like a piece of fruit hanging from a tree. The birds would come. The rain would fall. People would walk by and throw rocks or insults. The worst part was that you could see your own house, or see your friends walking to the market, but you couldn't call out to them. Eventually, the person would pass away from thirst or heat. But the cage stayed up. The bones would stay in the cage for years, rattling in the wind. Every time a traveler entered the city, they saw the cage and knew, don't break the law here. Number 8, crushed, pain forte et dur. Have you ever had a heavy blanket on you that felt a little too tight? Now imagine if that blanket was made of giant, heavy rocks. This is a strange one. It wasn't always meant to kill you. It was a way to make you talk. In England, if you refused to say guilty or not guilty in court, the judge couldn't take your land. To protect their families, some brave people refused to speak. The person was laid on the floor. A wooden door was placed on top of them. Then, the guards would start placing heavy stones on the door. One by one. The weight made it harder and harder to breathe. The person's ribs would start to creak. The executioner would ask, "Will you plead?" If the person stayed silent, more stones were added. A man named Giles Corey famously endured this for 2 days. Every time they asked him to speak, he just said, "More weight." He wanted them to finish it so his children could keep his farm. Eventually, the weight became too much for the heart to handle. It was a slow, heavy way to die, fueled by the love for one's family and a very stubborn heart. Number 7, the elephant's foot. When we think of elephants, we think of gentle giants at the zoo. But in Southeast Asia and India, an elephant was the most powerful executioner in the world. Elephants are incredibly smart. Kings would train them for years to be judges. These elephants knew exactly how to kill a person based on what the king whispered to them. The prisoner was tied down in the middle of a big arena. The elephant would walk out. The crowd would go silent. The elephant would stand over the person, its huge foot hovering just inches away from their chest. If the king wanted to be merciful, the elephant would step down hard on the head, ending it in 1 second. But if the king was angry, he would tell the elephant to be slow. The elephant would step on an arm, then a leg, then the other arm. It would use its trunk to toss the person like a rag doll. It showed that even nature itself was under the king's control. The sheer size of the animal made the person look tiny and unimportant. It was a display of pure, massive power. Number 6, the iron grate. What's the difference between a campfire and a stove? A stove has a grill. And in the Middle Ages, the grill was used for more than just cooking food. This was a favorite for people who were seen as enemies of the church. It was called the gridiron. Instead of a big fire at a stake, they would use a metal bed made of bars. They would light a small, slow fire underneath it. The goal was slow roasting. They didn't want big flames, they wanted the metal to get hot. A famous story tells of a man named Saint Lawrence who was put on the grate. He was so brave that he supposedly told the executioners, "I'm done on this side, turn me over." While that might be a legend, the reality was much grimmer. The smell of the smoke and the heat of the metal made it one of the most painful ways to go. It was a death that took a long time and happened right in front of everyone's eyes. Number 5, the Wheel of Thorns. Imagine a collar that you can never take off. And inside that collar are dozens of tiny, sharp needles. This was a walking punishment. Sometimes the law didn't want to kill you right away. They wanted you to suffer while you walked around the town. They would lock an iron collar around your neck. The inside of the collar was covered in spikes. They also put a heavy wheel around your waist that also had spikes. You couldn't sit down. You couldn't lie down. You couldn't even lean against a wall without a spike poking you. You would get tired, but you couldn't sleep. Eventually, the person would get so exhausted they would start to fall over, but the spikes would wake them up. It was a cycle of pain that lasted for days until the person's body simply gave up from lack of sleep and infection. It turned the simple act of existing into a chore. Number 4, the dungeon sickness. Sometimes, the executioner isn't a person. Sometimes, the executioner is just a very, very dirty room. In the Middle Ages, prisons weren't like they are today. There were no doctors, no clean water, and no soap. If you were sent to a deep dungeon, you weren't expected to come back. The air in these dungeons was thick and damp. There were rats everywhere. The water they gave you to drink usually came from the same place the waste went. People would get something called jail fever, jail fever. Their skin would turn yellow, their teeth would fall out, and they would start to see things that weren't there. It wasn't a spectacle for a crowd. It was a lonely, cold way to go. You would sit in the straw, listening to the rats, getting weaker every day. It shows that sometimes, the worst way to die isn't the most violent, it's just the one where you are the most alone. Number 3, sink or swim, drowning. Head I win, tails you lose. We've all played that game. But for women accused of being witches, the game was, if you swim, we kill you. If you sink, you're innocent, but you're dead anyway. This was called the ordeal by water. People believed that water was pure, and it would reject anyone who was evil. They would tie the person's right thumb to their left big toe. Then they would throw them into a deep pond. If the person floated, it was proof the water didn't want them, so they were guilty and executed. If they sank, they were innocent, but they were tied up at the bottom of a pond. Often, the guards wouldn't pull them out in time. Towns actually built ducking stools, chairs on long wooden arms, just for this. It was like a playground ride from a nightmare. It was a way for the town to feel like they were letting God decide, but the result was almost always the same. Number 2, quartering. What is the most famous execution in history? For many, it's William Wallace, Braveheart. And his end was the most complicated show the law ever put on. This was called being hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was only for the worst crime, treason, trying to kill the king. First, the person was dragged through the streets on a wooden frame. Then they were hanged, but only for a few seconds, they were cut down while they were still alive. Then came the quartering. The executioner would use a knife to remove the person's insides. Finally, they would use axes or horses to pull the body into 4 pieces, quarters. But the payoff was what happened next. The 4 pieces were sent to 4 different cities across the country. 1 arm to the north, 1 to the south, and so on. The head was put on a spike on London Bridge. The king wanted everyone in the entire country to see a piece of the traitor. It was a way to make one death feel like it was happening everywhere at once. Number 1, the garrote. We've seen fire, water, animals, and saws. But the number 1 spot goes to something that seems simple, but is the most chilling of all. It's called the garrote. The garrote was used for centuries. It was an iron collar on a wooden post. It was designed to be efficient. The person sat in a chair. The iron collar was placed around their neck. Behind the post, the executioner held a big wooden handle or a screw. As the executioner turned the screw, the collar got tighter and tighter. It didn't just stop the person from breathing, it was designed to snap the neck or crush the windpipe slowly. Unlike the wild executions like the breaking wheel, the garrote was quiet. It was cold. It was like a machine. It represents the moment history moved from messy, medieval deaths to mechanical, modern ones. It was used in some places all the way until the 1970s. It is a reminder that the human imagination has always been very, very good at finding ways to bring life to an end. Conclusion: the lesson of the past. Why did we look at all these horrible things today? Is it just because they are scary? No. We look at them because they remind us how much the world has changed. Today, we believe in fair trials and human rights. But for 1,000 years, the world was a place where justice was a bloody, public show. The people who lived back then weren't monsters. They were people just like us, but they lived in a world of constant war and fear. They thought these punishments were the only way to keep their families safe. When you look at an old castle or a museum with an iron collar, remember, that's not just a piece of metal. It's a story. It's a warning. And it's a part of our history that we must never forget, so that we never, ever go back to it. Next time you walk past a quiet park or a peaceful street, be glad you live in the world you do. Because in the Middle Ages, the street was a much, much scarier place.